Thank you for sharing those beautiful words with me of the African American National Anthem. So many moons ago, way back in 2022, if you can remember back that far, I did a lesson that I cheekily called Jesus Did the Hokey Pokey. And it was fun, I thought. And as I was preparing for today, every time I read, bring your whole self into the experience, I finished it with, and you do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. I will spare you me singing that this morning, but at home, I sang it out loud and giggled every time. Because when we bring our whole self into an experience, we do often find ourselves turned around. Yeah, with a different view. Very different view. So let's get to it. Bring your whole self to the experience. Now, next Sunday, some guys are going to get together and they're going to play a football game that they consider to be very super. So much so that they call it the Super Bowl. Now, two teams will meet on a field and they're going to bring their whole selves. They're going to bring their grit, their game faces. They're all going to be wearing shoulder pads. Nobody's going to show up on that field without shoulder pads. Some will wear knee pads, and none of them's going to have one arm strapped down to their side. They're going to be using both of their arms. They'll be in full uniform. They're going to bring their whole self. And so will the crowd. How many thousands of people show up for the Super Bowl? How many more thousands of people will be sitting at home, coaching from their sofa, critiquing as loudly as they can? Their faces will be painted. They'll have their foam fingers forming number one. They'll wear their jerseys, their jackets, their hats of their chosen team, and their voices will be loud. Very loud. They'll be bringing their whole self to this experience of the Super Bowl game. So if we can do this for a game, I wonder what keeps us from doing this in everyday life, every moment. What keeps us from bringing our whole self for our life? Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's the fear of being known as we truly are. We often show up in the world as always perky, always happy, always cheerful, always positive. And that's how we show up for other people sometimes. And we might want to avoid letting the world see that we're exhausted, that we're sad, that we're disillusioned, or disappointed, or that, we're in a negative space. We might not want to share that with the world. And while we think that keeping that to ourselves is keeping us safe, we miss the opportunity of allowing our community to support us, to honor us, wherever we might be, emotionally or physically or spiritually. My goodness, we certainly don't want to show up at church and let anybody know we're struggling spiritually. What would they think? What would they think if they thought that their minister was having a hard time praying? What would people think? So we hide that. We hide it. And when we share it and allow our community to support us, it's a catalyst for our change, for our healing, and it's a catalyst for the healing and changing of others. It allows others to share in their compassion, their salvation, and we prevent others from participating in it. Because in order for somebody to be able to give of themselves, there has to be somebody to receive it. And it just might be us on any given day. So when we show up with those vulnerabilities, it allows others to live their spiritual life. And when we move in the world only showing a carefully chosen part of ourselves, we begin to suppress the rest. When I suppress anger, resentment, jealousy, I suppress my unforgiveness, my suffering, or even my grief. And we think that we're not supposed to suffer. After all, we're in all these spiritual practices, so we're not going to suffer, are we? Yes, indeed, we are. We can't live this life and escape some moment of suffering in our life. We feel like there might be something wrong with us, that we might be broken, that we're doing this spiritual stuff wrong, that we're a failure of some kind if we're struggling or suffering. And I have said that I believe that I cannot suppress my anger without also suppressing my pleasure. I cannot suppress my suffering without, to some degree, suppressing my happiness. I can't suppress my hatred without compromising my love. Let me say first, I don't move from those places, but I acknowledge it. And it doesn't mean that I run around dumping hatred, anger, resentment, jealousy all over the world. No, that's not what we do with it. But we let it rise. We let it rise. We let it tell us what wants to be healed, what wants to be nurtured, what wants to be forgiven, and what wants to be released. Mark Nepo, the author of The Endless Practice, tells us that every thought and every feeling has a cycle. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So think back to 11:30 yesterday. Can you think of what you were doing? Think of what you were feeling. Is it the same as what you're feeling right now, today? Not quite. And guess what? Tomorrow at 11:30, you're going to have a whole new set of thoughts, a whole new set of feelings. So let them come. Garner the wisdom, receive the gift from them, and allow them to go. So very often, those thoughts and feelings that we label as negative, the ones that we feel like we need to put aside and not acknowledge, are rooted in fear. And we can honor them. We can explore them. We can garner wisdom from us. I really believe that our feelings and our thoughts come for a purpose. As we live our spiritual journeys, as we continue our spiritual life and expansion, it might mean that I put aside a feeling for a moment. If I'm in the middle of a meeting, I'm not going to bring up my anger and dissect it. I'm going to notice that I'm feeling anger at any moment. Then I'm going to sit. I'm going to sit with that anger, and I'm going to feel it, and I'm going to invite it to share what I'm to know from that anger. There's a hurt that hasn't been healed. And if I feel anger, I might be fearful of being seen as not enough. Has anybody ever felt like they're not enough? Yeah, I see hands, I see faces, I see smiles, yes. Many of us, if not all of us, have come to a moment in life where you felt like, oh dear, I'm really out of my league. I am not enough for this. We might not feel smart enough, attractive enough, spiritual enough, educated enough, or wealthy enough. Whatever enough rises is our fear. If I feel hatred, I might feel fearful of losing what I claim to be mine. I know that when I worked in senior care and Medicare made all their changes, I was fearful that I would lose my job because of all the changes that were being made. I was expendable to the company. So I became fearful. I might be fearful of losing my status. I might be fearful of losing a relationship, even if the relationship is not uplifting and honoring of me. It's what I know, and I might be fearful of losing the known. These low vibration of emotions are often triggered by beliefs of separation. You know, that anger, fear, rejection. In my individuality, if I see myself separate from another person, I might feel fearful of that because of gender, because of age. And what are some of the other ways that we see people as apart from us? By culture, by race, by ethnicity, by educational background, by religion. We tend to have a human nature of sifting, separating, and sorting people into categories. And when I only bring part of myself to any experience, there's a hole that remains, an empty space. When we bring our whole self to an experience, we can say, this is me. Here I am. Take me as I am. And as I see and honor your divine, perhaps you will do the same for me. See and honor my divine. Perhaps you will be part of my growing, of my expanding, of my learning. Frank, the author of Frank Augusta, the author of the 5 Invitations. And oh my gosh, this is a great book. I have pencil mark, I have post-it notes, I have dog-eared pages, every page. This is a fabulous book. He tells a story of being in Thailand and walking the beach in Thailand with his teenage daughter. And he was noticing she was kind of in a funky mood. And yes, she was a teenager, but he sensed that there was more to it because she wasn't even noticing the beauty that was around as they walked. It turned out that she was worried about a boy. Imagine a teenager being worried about a relationship. Who was at home, who she couldn't reach. And she felt that she had to get to a phone to reach out to him, to have a conversation with him. And as Frank talked to her name is Gina, she was afraid that he did not return her feelings. So she was carrying the fearfulness. And as Frank invited her to sit with the feeling, to let the feeling rest in her, to identify it. Well, as a teenager, she didn't want to be rejected. So they explored it a little more. And he explained to his beautiful teenage daughter that our thoughts are merely thoughts. They are not who we are. The thoughts of being fearful of rejection, it's not who she is. She's a bright, brilliant teenage girl. They come up and they go. So in time, she was able to relax and be at ease and enjoy. But if she had not brought her whole self to that experience, if Frank had not brought his whole self to that experience, he would have missed the opportunity for that insightful conversation. She would have missed the opportunity to relinquish the thought of fear and to let it go. When we bring our whole self to an experience, this can meld with that. And it can come together for a whole new feeling. deeply informed idea, a rich knowing of wisdom, of resilience, of courage, of strength, all of those wonderful things. And when we show up in life in part, rather than in whole, the whole of us, the love and the hate, the kindness and compassion and the not kindness and compassion, when we don't show up, we're resisting something. We're resisting ourselves. We're resisting aspects of ourselves that we call negative. We're refusing to allow what wishes to rise in us and emerge through us to be. We resist it. And by embracing that all that we are, we heal that hole that's made by leaving part out. We heal the hole. We heal the wounds. We heal the bruises in us. Welcome the oneness that we are with the divine. We welcome the oneness that we are with each other. When we bring our wholeness, all of us, the totality of us, not even leaving out the smallest of freckles, we live life in the center, in the depth, not out here on the circumference. Live the deepness of life and bring your whole self to the experience. And Frank says that when we bring our whole self, marvelous, miraculous things can happen. And he tells this story. Years ago, he had been invited to lead a retreat around multi-faith, bearing witness. And that's being present. And this retreat happened to be in Auschwitz. And every day, the people who attended gathered and meditated and prayed in different places throughout the camp. And they chanted the names of those who had died in Auschwitz. One evening, Frank was pretty restless, and he went to one of the barracks that housed children. And he sat and prayed, and in a short time, he heard someone come in the other end of the barracks. He heard them come in weeping, crying, wailing that turned into screams. It was a woman who had been in Auschwitz as a child. So you can imagine the feelings that flowed. He moved and sat next to her. In a period of time, he held her as she cried through the entire night. And as sunrise came, they hugged, they embraced each other, and they went on with their day, having recognized that wholeness of each other, the deepness of the grief in that experience. And as it turned out, a few days later, he traveled to Berlin to do a workshop on grief and forgiveness. So the workshop lasted a couple of days. And at the end of the workshop, a woman stood up and said, "You know, I've been listening to you talk about grief and talk about the importance of forgiveness. But my father was killed in one of the concentration camps, and my heart is ice cold, and I cannot forgive those who killed him." And there was absolute silence in the room. Until on the other side of the auditorium, a woman rose and said, "My heart is of ice too. You see, my father was a German soldier. He worked as a guard in Auschwitz. I know that my father killed people. My heart is icy and I cannot forgive him. Once again, silence fell across the auditorium. And the two women stood and walked to the center of the auditorium. And through many tears, they hugged and held each other. Now, can you imagine what happened to their hearts in that moment? All because they were both courageous and brave enough to bring their whole self, not just the happy laughter of their life, but the hardcore pain. They brought it to the moment. Created a beautiful experience of healing, of hope, hopefully forgiveness. So bring your whole self to the experience. And to me, this means to leave nothing out. To set aside my awkwardness, my unsettledness with being vulnerable, to set aside the fear of what another person will think. It means to bring it all and allow those tender parts of me to show wherever I am. Those tender, weak moments as well as those moments that I'm strong. It allows light to shine on all of it. To soften my sharp edges and my rough places. To incorporate it all means that in the wholeness, the healing, the healed wholeness of myself. And Richard Rohr says something about that in this handy little book called Just This. He says, it seems as though we are addicted to our need to make distinction and judgment, which we mistake for thinking. Most of us think that we are thinking, yet almost all thinking is compulsive, repetitive, and habitual. We are forever writing our inner commentaries on everything, commentaries that always reach the same practical conclusions. That is why all forms of meditation and contemplation teach a way of quieting this compulsively driven, unconsciously programmed mind. And then he says, the desert fathers and mothers wisely called this process shedding the thoughts. We don't fight, repress, deny, identify with, or even judge them. We merely shed them. We are so much more than our thoughts about things. And we will feel this more as an unlearning rather than a learning of any new content. So there's one thing to remember as we accept the invitation to bring our whole self. And we hear it in 1 Corinthians 16:14. To let all you do be done with love. So it is.